My God, is this all the men we have? What regiment is this?
1st Minnesota, General.
Colonel, charge and take those colors.
Attention, 1st Minnesota. Right shoulder shift arms. Forward double quick. March!
Every man realized in an instant what Hancock's order meant. Death or wounds to us all. The sacrifice of the regiment to gain a few minutes' time and save the position, and probably the battlefield.
For Robert E. Lee, this was it. Lee knew that invading the North, this was how he was going to win the war for the Confederacy. The United States of America is at stake.
Minnesota's Civil War Commemoration Task Force was created by executive order of Governor Mark Dayton. Chaired by Secretary of State Mark Ritchie and Representative Dean Erdahl, the task force led a delegation of Minnesotans to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the three-day battle. In July 2013, this Minnesota contingent of elected officials, authors, educators, artists, history buffs, and students toured the battlefield and retraced the steps of the 1st Regiment of Minnesota Volunteer Infantry.
From Wheaton, from Sauk Rapids, from Owatonna, from Rochester, from Duluth, from, of course, Minneapolis and St. Paul.
What the 1st Minnesota did at the Battle of Gettysburg, it definitely needed to be commemorated by the people of Minnesota at the 150th anniversary.
All right, then there's the space where Lee is. I got a call from Daryl Sanis to guide the Minnesota Task Force around Gettysburg over the 150th anniversary. I was just honored to do that. It was great.
The battle was Robert E. Lee's second and final invasion of the North.
The Battle of Gettysburg is called a meeting engagement, where both sides kind of accidentally on purpose run into each other. It seems inevitable that they would end up at Gettysburg, because Gettysburg is just about 8 or 9 miles north of the Maryland line. 10 roads lead to the town. It's like the spokes on a wheel. South of the town at Gettysburg is where the higher ground is. The famous places, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, Little Round Top. Once the Union Army gets that high ground, they're able to build that fishhook battle line, the upside down, backwards J. To the west of Gettysburg is a series of rolling hills where the Confederates come in on.
On July 1, 1863, the storied cupola of the Lutheran Seminary, just west of town, served as the best vantage point to observe the converging Union and Confederate troops that would soon number more than 160,000. Closed to the public for many years, it reopened on July 1, 2013.
Very special to go up and see the view that those officers could see 150 years ago.
On July 2nd, General Dan Sickles moves forward out of the Union fishhook battle line that General Meade has created. And by moving forward, he opens up a gap in the Union line. From that point on, General Hancock and General Meade are throwing reinforcements as fast as they can to fill that mile-long gap in the line. Great confusion on the field, and Hancock rides over to the Minnesota boys.
Union General Winfield Hancock ordered Colonel William Colville of Red Wing to lead his Minnesota regiment into Confederate forces from Alabama that outnumbered them more than 5 to 1.
If men ever become devils, that was one of the times. We were crazy with the excitement of the fight. We just rushed in like wild beasts.
They got down in that valley of Plum Run. Certainly they were losing men as they went. They were taking fire. They maintained the best line they could, went right into the rebels and sacrificed themselves. Only veterans could do that.
I think this temporary check we gave the enemy was of the utmost importance. For as soon as they had formed, they would have pushed forward. They would have immediately captured a battery and probably broken through our lines.
The Minnesota boys were able to hold them off for 15 minutes, long enough to get reinforcements and to plug that gap in the line.
Of the 262 men under Colville's command, only 47 answered the initial roll call later that evening. 150 years later, Minnesotans retraced the steps of this charge down to Plum Run and into enemy fire. what remained of the Minnesota Regiment had to repel Pickett's charge on July 3rd.
Pickett's charge is Lee's final attempt to destroy the Union Army. Lee believes that after he sends these 12,000 to 13,000 men over, that the Union Army is going to break and run, and he's going to win the war. Minnesota men found themselves right smack in the middle of Pickett's charge, the place where you really don't want to be. They're beat up, but they're not beaten, and they're going to make a tremendous stand.
Men swore and cursed and struggled and fought, kicked and yelled and hurrahed.
Robert E. Lee's desperate move failed. His army decimated. He retreated on July 4th. His wagon train of wounded stretched for 17 miles. It was the last major engagement for what remained of the 1st Minnesota Regiment.
Let's move over to the Minnesota urn.
There was a gentle rain when we got to that urn right in the cemetery.
It was placed by the survivors of the 1st Minnesota just a couple years after the war.
The students placing the 1st Minnesota flags on every one of the markers. That's the biggest takeaway that I'll have.
The task force trip to Gettysburg was an opportunity to remember and reflect on how far we have come.
Gettysburg is part of the American psyche. Part of being a citizen of the United States is knowing a little bit of something that happened at Gettysburg. This is important to our nation.
Foes in 1863, Minnesota and Alabama troops this time met as friends on the site of the July 2nd battle.
If it wasn't for the 1st Minnesota, we wouldn't be standing here as citizens of the United States of America.
The sun was getting low there along Plum Run. A night of destiny, there for men with guns. The men of Minnesota, ready for the fray. The men of Alabama, wearing Southern gray. Would we be two nations, or would we be one? Would it be decided at Plum Run? Take those colors, the Minnesotans charged. So outnumbered, still they bet the farm. Just for buying time, good men had to die. That Minnesota charge. The gray line aimed and fired, hoping to break through. The noise was thunderous as the conflict grew. The Southern flag unfurled in its brilliant red, renewing all their passion as they fought and bled. But the Minnesotans made it mighty clear they were moving forward with no fear. Take those colors, the Minnesotans charged. So outnumbered, still they bet the farm. Just for buying time, good men had to die. That Minnesota charge. The screaming mini balls made the danger great. The Union had to fear canister and grave. The creek bed was a magnet turning into hell. There was no time for grieving when a comrade fell. certain they could get it done, letting loose their volley at Plum Run. Take those colors, the Minnesotans charged. So outnumbered, still they bet the farm. Just for buying time, good men had to die. That Minnesota charge. They plunged into the swell, knowing it was grim. They knew it had to be if they were to win. They had a resolution not to give 1 inch, so they could guard an asset, Cemetery Ridge. Lumberjacks and farmers from so far away showed their love of union in that place. Take those colors, the Minnesotans charged. So outnumbered, still they bet the farm. Just for buying time, good men had to die. That Minnesota charge, that Minnesota charge.
I'm Brian Pease, Site Manager at the Minnesota State Capitol Historic Site. Minnesota sent 22 military units consisting of infantry regiments, sharpshooters, artillery, and cavalry, about 24,000 men to fight in the Civil War. A lot of those units were in the thick of the fight at Shiloh and Gettysburg, Missionary Ridge, and Nashville, while others had rather limited wartime experiences, but still played a very vital role in protecting railroads in Kentucky and Tennessee. Throughout the state capitol, the efforts of those soldiers is commemorated in dramatic paintings, larger-than-life statues, and a display of battle flags used in the war. In this episode, we take a look at 3 military units whose collective experience typifies the contributions and sacrifices made in the country's darkest hour. The 2nd Minnesota Volunteer Infantry was organized in July 1861 and sent to Louisville, Kentucky that October. While there, the regiment received this national battle flag as a gift from the Loyal Ladies of Louisville, one of that border state's pro-Union groups. The flag is proudly marked for the January 1862 Battle of Mill Springs, Kentucky, where combat was so close that the men of the 2nd Minnesota were poking their guns through the same fence as the Confederate forces. The Union triumphed that day, and Mill Springs was the first significant Northern victory of the war. In the stinging defeat of the Union Army at Chickamauga in the fall of 1863, the 2nd Minnesota was one of the last units to leave the field of battle. After that loss, the Union Army retreated into Chattanooga, Tennessee, and was surrounded and was being starved out by the Confederate Army. In the attempt to break out of this precarious situation, the 2nd Minnesota participated in one of the most memorable events of the Civil War on November 25, 1863, at the Battle of Missionary Ridge. Together with 60 other regiments, the 2nd Minnesota made a successful assault on the Confederate rifle pits at the base of the ridge. Having either misunderstood the orders or simply being caught up in the moment, the Union regiment continued past the first line and charged all the way to the top of the ridge and overwhelmed the defending Confederates. This unexpected and daring event also came at some cost. During this scramble to the top, the 2nd Minnesota had 6 of its 7 color bearers killed or wounded. After Missionary Ridge, the 2nd Minnesota finished out the war as a part of Sherman's March to the Sea and took part in the Union Army's post-war Grand Review in Washington. The regiment was discharged at Fort Snelling on July 20th, 1865. The 9th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry was organized at Fort Snelling in August 1862. Rather than heading south, the regiment first went to central and western Minnesota to garrison outposts during the U.S.-Dakota War. The unit then moved around the Civil War's Western Theater, stationed variously at St. Louis, Kansas City, and Memphis. At the Battle of Guntown, also known as Bryce's Crossroads, in June of 1864, it covered the retreat of the shattered Union Army, but 200 of its exhausted soldiers were captured. They were sent to prisoner of war camps, including Andersonville Prison. Nearly half of those men never returned back to Minnesota. In July 1864, at the Battle of Tupelo, Mississippi, the regiment lost its colonel, Alexander Wilkin. He was the highest-ranking officer from Minnesota to die during the Civil War. On December 15th and 16th, 1864, the 9th, along with 3 other Minnesota regiments, took part in the Battle of Nashville. During its charge at Shias Hill, the regiment was one of the first to reach and plant its colors in the Confederate defenses, a remarkable feat after advancing 400 yards through a muddy cornfield and under fire the entire time. It was the last major engagement in the West and a decisive Union victory, and effectively destroyed Confederate forces in Tennessee. The 9th Minnesota spent the war's closing days participating in sieges of Confederate fortifications on Mobile Bay, Alabama. The regiment was discharged at Fort Snelling on August 24, 1865. Minnesota's 1st Battery Light Artillery was organized in November 1861. The unit went to Tennessee and faced its first test in the Battle of Shiloh on April 6 and 7, 1862. On the 6th, the 1st Battery held a position in the Hornet's Nest, scene of the most intense fighting on the Union line. The men held their position for 7 long hours before the Confederates finally pushed through. Federal reinforcements arrived overnight, and the next day, the Union prevailed. The 1st Battery went on to see action in the October 3rd and 4th, 1862 Battle of Corinth, Mississippi, where the Union triumphed at this crucial railroad junction. The unit later fought at Vicksburg, Mississippi, Kennesaw Mountain, Georgia, and took part in Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia and the Carolinas. In keeping with military protocol, the 1st Battery's unit flag is a vivid red and displays the cross cannons symbolic of the artillery. In addition to the unit's various battle honors, the blue arrow represents the emblem of the 17th Army Corps. The 1st Battery Light Artillery was discharged at Fort Snelling on June 30th, 1865. Whether in heated combat or guarding supply lines, Minnesota had an important role on all fronts of the Civil War. 150 years later, we continue to honor their sacrifices.